All right, folks, in this lab number 2, exercise 2, we will be building a console app. Now, the purpose of this console app is to exercise the graph API that we talked about in module 1. So during module 1, we used the Microsoft provided Graph Explorer. So now, this time, we're going to build a confidential client. Now, there are public clients, there are confidential clients. And the way that the token is issued, the access token is issued, is slightly different. So in a confidential client, one of the things we should be aware of is that the client is going to directly authenticate against Azure AD. Now, keep in mind the reason why it's called confidential client. It means that you should build a program that runs in a trusted environment. So in other words, it's not something that you will run on a customer's computer. It's not something that you will run on someone's browser, because in this client there is going to be confidential information. In this program that we're going to build, we will have a shared secret. Okay, that shared secret is shared between our program, our client, and the Azure AD. It is through that shared secret the client authenticate to the Azure AD identity store. Now, there are two ways to make this authentication. One is through shared key, secret, or a certificate. Okay, you can upload a public portion of the certificate that you have access to, and you can build a confidential client from the certificate as well. Now, once you're able to authenticate this app, you will then be able to exercise the API permission that's granted to the client. Now, in this exercise, we are going to grant user.readAll, which is going to be a permission that requires admin consent. And we're going to consent so our app can obtain an access token with that scope. And once the access token is granted, we will then make a request against the Graph API endpoints. We will be, if I remember correctly, exercising some of the commands, some of the OData commands, such as select, top, order by, and filter as we build this console app. All right, so first thing we need to do is go to Azure Portal and register our console app. All right, so this is our familiar section where we register our console app. So I'm going to call this app Graph Console App. Now, this is only going to be a single tenant. That's all we're going to build this for. This is not a web app, so the redirect URI is irrelevant for this exercise. You can fill something in, but it's not going to affect you one way or the other. Now, what is important is that we take down the application ID, and the tenant ID. We'll need this momentarily. So let's get this out of the way. So let's just get these two things. All right, close enough. All right, so we got these two pieces of data. Next, API permissions. We need to make sure that we give this app. So it's not important just to read user. We are going to build a confidential application that authenticate on its own. So it isn't going to be delegated by an interactive user. There is no user login in the app we are going to build. The application is just going to start, and it's going to take the secret we embed into the source code, and then authenticate to Azure AD. So user, there's a user. All right, so we're going to read all of user's profile. Now, keep in mind that this type of high-level permission requires a global admin or enterprise application admin or application admin to grant that permission. So it's not yet granted unless you click on this button. So it doesn't count unless you grant admin consent. So don't forget this step. So after you sign it, make sure you click on that. All right, last and finally, before I leave, I need to obtain a secret. Now, you guys are watching this video, so there's a good chance that this key is immediately compromised. But it's important that you copy this, okay, and save it I'm gonna tell you why. Because this key, this is that shared secret. Okay. If you don't copy it right now and you navigate away from this page, it will not show you again. You can generate another one. Okay. But you will not be able to retrieve what is in the value. Now, of course, the more secure way, if I were to do this, I would do I'll generate a certificate. Okay, there's a PowerShell script that can generate it. There's a make cert, whichever you like. Export the public key, and then upload the public key here. Now, as you create your confidential application, you need to go to your cert store and look for the certificate thumbprint. Okay, now it's not covered by this lab, so I won't be going into that. We'll just take a shortcut here and use the client secret. But understand that certificate's much more proper way to do it. Okay, and also notice there's expiration. So for all of you looking at this, if I forget to delete this, actually I should remember to delete it. All right, so there's that. So we got this permission all squared away. Let's go ahead and build an app. All right, so this is going to generate a new console app template. Put this on the side. All right. All right, so I'm gonna make sure I add these packages, Microsoft.identity.client. So these are the packages that we'll need throughout the code we're gonna build. All right, so this is the package we're gonna need, Microsoft Identity Client. Okay, so these are things that contains the classes, that interfaces that we are going to use to build stuff. All right, so let's make sure we set up the App Settings Json. This is the default file name. We usually stick to this file naming convention, App Settings.json, to keep our configuration files. All right, so we're going to copy and paste these values. All right, so I've configured this tenant ID, application ID, and application secret. I'm not sure what this redirect URL is good for. I'm going to leave it the way it is. If it blows up, then I can learn why it blows up. And next time when I record this video, I'll remember to remind people to use a redirect URI. But based on the confidential client, as far as I know, we probably don't need that. All right, so folks, the next thing we are going to do is creating a delegating handler. Now, this delegating handler will handle our authorization needs. Okay, so in other words, every time when we send a request, okay, we are going to make sure the request is authenticated. Okay, so we need to create a new file called auth handler. So this is going to inherit from delegating handler. We will be expecting someone giving us in the constructor an authentication provider, as well as an HTTP message handler. Okay, so whoever construct us is going to provide us with these two things. So every time we send a request, we're going to ask the authentication provider to authenticate this request. Okay, and once and only once the authentication succeed, will we go ahead and send the request. All right. So the reason we are writing this class is so that we have an authentication provider who knows how to go out and how to get access token, how to add that to the request header before the request is sent. So this is one of the many HTTP handlers that's in the pipeline. So if you're interested in what delegating handler is, you may have to you may want to go look up ASP.NET delegating handler. It's a way for us to inject headers as part of the HTTP request. Okay, so in this case, we are going to work on an authentication provider next. Now, this authentication provider we are going to implement will handle the Microsoft Azure AD authentication. Okay, so we will be using the MSAL, the missile for .NET. Okay, that's why we need the Microsoft.identity.client package. So our next class is to implement this authentication provider. That guy's job is to authenticate our app and obtain an access token and put that into the authorization header bears token on every request. So once that method is called, our request will always carry that authorization header. All right, so here we're going to call it MSAL Authentication Provider. So this is going to implement that interface, Authentication Provider, because our program will know how to obtain the token. And once the token is obtained, it will add it to the request header. So the delegating handler will call us. We will inject the authorization header bear space token. All right. Now there's also a method called get token async. Now in this get token async, we're going to make use of client application. Now you'll notice this client application is injected to the constructor. So whoever prepared this client application object needs to supply, for example, the AD tenant, the application ID, and those secrets. Okay, so that client application, that confidential client application will be injected to us in the constructor, and we're going to simply make a reference to it, or hold a reference to it at the private field. All right, now using that, we can call acquire token for client. If this succeed, we would have our access token. Now, when we acquire the token, we need to specify what is the scope that we want. And again, the scope is also injected to us. So whoever construct this MSAL authentication provider not only is going to provide us with an not only going to provide us with a confidential client application, it's also going to tell us what scope to request. Okay, so this is the implementation of an confidential client application, which the delegating handler is going to make a call in order to get the token it needs before it submits the request to the Graph API. So next we got to wire this all together. Get our namespace squared away. There's some private fields. Remember we created the app setting.json, right? So in that app setting.json contains all of our settings. Fair enough. So here we're going to use a configuration builder to look at the current directory and parse the application setting.json. That's going to give us config object. Now through the config object, we can pull back the app ID, the secrets, and the redirect URL tenant ID. Okay, so this is going to return us the configuration object. Fair enough. Okay, just line everything up. All right, so now obviously we need to also create an authorization provider. All right, so let's make sure we line everything up properly. That's my load app settings. Now, once the app setting is loaded, here's a method that, see, didn't get it right. This is the class. This is where the method is. All right, so we are going to take the configuration returned from the load app settings, And we're going to use this to create a confidential client. Now remember, the point here is to create a confidential client. We're going to read our application ID, application secret, and redirect URL. Now, frankly, with redirect URL. Okay, so the builder is going to supply the redirect URL. Not sure what it's good for. All right, so client ID, secret, redirect URI, and the authority is simply a concatenation of the tenant ID /v2. Now, you may want to take a note of this. Okay, the .default. This .default is a special meaning. So rather than saying I want graph.microsoft.com/users.readAll and another bunch of those scopes. Okay, so instead of adding a whole bunch of scope, what I want to do here is I want to wholesale request every single permission that was granted to my app. So instead of specifying 3, 4, 5 different things, by using the default, it just basically means I want all the permission that was statically granted. Now, understand that statically granted means it means something I granted from the Azure AD portal. Okay, so with redirect URI, with client secret, it is what it is. All right, so this is going to return me a new. So notice this constructor of my authentication provider takes in the confidential client and the scope. Okay, so that returns us the authentication provider that's needed by the delegating handler. So we're going to spin up an HTTP client, and the HTTP client is going to use that delegating handler, and that delegating handler depends on this authentication provider. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we need a helper method, one more helper method that give us the authenticated graph client. All right, so create authorization provider using the config. Okay, a new graph service client from that with that authentication provider, and this returns the graph client. All right, so I think we're all ready to rock. Now let's go back to the main. All right, so I'm going to read the settings. Config looks okay. All right. Okay. All right, so I'm going to call the get authenticated graph client with the config. So what I get back is a client that on every submission will include a bearers token. All right, so this says client.user. Now this is making a graph call. Okay, and we are going to get all of the users. Okay, so we are making that request that will give us perform an HTTP get of all the users, and then we're going to loop through each users and print out the user's info. All right, and we're also going to get the request message and look at the request URI. All right, so let's build and run it. Friendly reminder, make sure you save all the changes to the file before you build them. All right, so I did run the app, and of course the app says, dude, you gave me a redirect URI that was make no sense. The URI says your redirect URI here. Well, remember I said you really don't need it. So instead of leaving this in and add that redirect URI, understand that this is a confidential app. There's nothing to redirect back to. This is not a web app. There's no redirecting back and forth. So here you certainly don't need the redirect URI. So there's no reason to build a confidential client application to say redirect here. So in this case, I'm just going to comment this out. So after I comment this out, save the change, did another build. Okay, so it was complaining. And the second time I did the run, and I'm able to pull all the ID of the user back. All right, so This is the graph request URL, and that means it worked. Now, I want to go back to the code and show you a few interesting things. All right. So this is how we make the request. Client, which refers to our authenticated graph client. Right. So with that authenticated graph client, there's a user's endpoint. Okay. That user's endpoint right now we're going to request everything there is. All right. So here I'm going to use the OData keywords. Okay, if you remember, filter, select, order by, skip top. These are all keywords that we have covered in a previous OData section. So with this select, this is going to expect a lambda expression. So given a user, I want to display only the user's name, display name. Okay, I only want users dot email. Sorry, dot mail, not email. All right. So I'm projecting only 2 fields this time. All right. Rather than downloading a whole bunch of stuff, rather than downloading every single field. Now notice the very first time I ran it, I actually download every property of every user, even though all I displayed at the end of it is just the ID, the display name, and the email. So there's no reason to pull other things back. So here with this graph request, I'm able to project exactly what I want. All right. So I may want to just combine all this into a single command. All right. I'm going to comment that out. So go ahead and save that. All right. Well, the ID's gone because apparently I didn't include IDs in that selection list. So, folks, at least you know this is not rigged, right? Okay. So if I need ID, given user, I want user ID as well, so it doesn't blow up like that. All right. Now I can also add another filter top. I just want 2 records. I really don't have 15 records. All right. And perhaps order by. Given a user, I would like to, oh, actually, you know what? This is when I really miss Visual Studio because, you know, Visual Studio has this habit of showing me what I'm doing. Well, then on the other hand, I have this instruction that shows me what I'm doing because most of the times I don't have any clue what I'm doing. So this is going to do a get async and this will get results. All right, looking good. All right, so I'm going to run this. Hopefully there'll be 2. And by the luck of it, order by descending order. All right, so yeah, VI, VC, yeah, I is bigger than C, so it's in descending order. Well, now it's going to be rough because I have V and I have C. Okay. I can add some filter. Now I'm going to copy and paste what the instruction looks like from the lab, but I'm certain if I paste that into my code, I will come up with no results at all because just because I don't have that many users in my system. So filter start with surname A. So I'm going to start with surname C, Chin. The other user is just VC, so it has no surname. Or start with surname B. I'm going to erase all that just so it's much. All right. Now, folks, when you're doing this filter, make sure you get these quotes right. Okay, it's very easy to get these quotes off pairs. So let's see if this would do it. Make sure to save the change and give it a spin. All right, so this blows up. Why did it blow up? Sorting not supported for current query. So I've done goofed putting the sorting somewhere in the wrong place. I may want to put that after I do the filter. Top 2. Alright, so I'm going to give this a try, and I vaguely remember you can't do both at the same time. So I might have to comment this out actually. The user endpoint doesn't support combining filter and order by. It actually says there right in the instruction, and I wish I can read better. Okay, and this, I'm a 26-minute in. I'm not going to like re-record this whole thing, so it is what it is. Folks, just make sure that you know you cannot combine filter and order by in the users. It's a good piece of information, but it's one of those information that, you know, I file under, it will bark at me if I do something bad. Alright, so folks, this is a hello world. To recap, we first registered an app with Azure AD. We granted some application permission. We grabbed the secret. We built a confidential client. We used a delegating header to inject the access token, the bearers token every time I make a request. And we used the Graph API endpoint for reading user data. And that Graph API endpoint is this guy, client.users. So if you use client, if you can look at this is the Graph client, notice there's all sorts of things. There are chats, there are contacts, there are calendars, appointments, events, that sort of thing. Me, SharePoint sites, subscriptions, teams, and other things. Okay, so there's that. .me, so this is you, my calendar. Okay, if you want to access other people's calendar, you got to figure out how to do that. Okay, this lab isn't it. All right, so this is all my stuff, client.me. All right, so folks, this is the hello world version of the Graph API using a confidential client with an embedded secret.